Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hello and welcome to episode 357 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory and my guest today is a familiar voice to many of you. Our podcast sponsor and regular contributor, Dara McLaughlin. Dara has shared some brilliant insights over the years on how counsellors can use their websites not just as a digital shopfront, but as a living tool to inform potential clients and reflect polished professional practice. Today, he joins us once again to talk through how to maximise your website's presence and integrate it effectively with your social platforms, creating a joined-up, mixed economy approach to your online visibility. So with that said, let's roll the intro.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Very warm welcome to episode 357 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with Rory Oakes, my colleague, and myself, Ken Kelly, where we're going to be walking you through three topics today, starting with ethical, sustainable practice, where we're delving into what will you do when your usual supervisor isn't available. This is an important topic and well worth considering before you find yourself in that situation. We then move on to Practice Matters, where we have a returning visitor. It's Dara McLaughlin from Web Healer, one of the sponsors of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, and he is sharing freely and openly what you can do to improve and maximize your website presence. So if you've got a website, you want to be listening to that one. And then, of course, we recognize you, students, on your formal journey to become a counsellor or a psychotherapist or to gain the counselling skills. And in student services today, we're going to be speaking about, should counselling students pay for a placement? And I know that can bring up really strong emotions with many, many people. And we're going to be delving a little bit deeper into that. And we have got our roving correspondent, Paul Cullen, who's going to be weighing in on that as well. But yes, Rory, let's kick off episode 357, speaking about when your usual supervisor isn't available.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And, I think it's really easy, isn't it, when you're working in private practice to get into a sort of routine, a rhythm. You have your diary, you have your clients, you go to supervision, you book your next supervision, and so on and so forth. And your supervisor might go on holiday, and, you might just move your supervision a week or 2 weeks. It sometimes happens. But what happens when your supervisor isn't available for a long time, or you feel that when your supervisor goes on holiday, which is what you should really do, you need some cover supervision? What do you do? Speaking from experience, having to find a supervisor at very short notice because one of my clients knew my supervisor. I mean, how unusual is that? I was working with a client and they talked about a person they didn't like very much, and they mentioned the person's name, and it was my supervisor. And I thought to myself,
Ooh.
what? I know, It was in my very early practice years. When I was a student. I think it was my second client, and I thought, what am I going to do? And that was a really tough lesson learned very early on in practice. And I realised from that day to this, or certainly when I practiced, that I would need to build a network of people that I could go to, or at least have a very good idea of where I could go if I needed some cover supervision. And it's happened a couple of times in my career where my supervisor hadn't been available, so I had to find another supervisor. And the critical thing is that it's not a supervisor for me. It's a supervisor to supervise my work with clients. So my supervisor needed to have an understanding of the client base that I was working with, and also the modality that I was using. So I think the message really is to think about what would happen if your supervisor just couldn't turn up. Where would you go? And it took a lot of research to find a supervisor.
Yeah. Yes. And you say this, and you may be listening and thinking, wow, that's an interesting consideration. That's never happened to me. How common is that? Well, it is more common than you might think. It certainly happened to me as well, Rory, that I had a situation where I needed to take a client to a different supervisor. And it also showed itself kind of as an immediacy within a session. It just happened. And I also want to say that certainly in the Counselling Tutor Facebook group where we have these kind of conversations, I have often seen individuals posting in saying, hey, any supervisors out there, I need emergency supervision, my supervisor's ill, or whatever the reason is. So it happens. And I think that the importance of this topic that you've brought today, Rory, is that we get the opportunity to think about these kind of events coming up before they're here. And as you correctly said, Rory, if you find yourself in that moment where you suddenly need to scramble to get a supervisor stand-in in an emergency situation, you can be it can put pressure on you that maybe if you had a plan and had thought this through beforehand, it would be more service to you, your practice, and your clients. So I think I'd like to start this conversation, Rory, because there's a number of different stops along this journey of this discussion, and we will be sharing some resources with you as well. I'm going to say that. So stick with this content of where you might look if you do have that emergency need. But I think we first need to recognize why we would get a supervisor in, why that might be at short notice, why it might be quite an emergency to us. And this is because we are called to by our ethical bodies, and we are called to from those that ensure our practices to have regular counselling supervision to maintain the appropriate ongoing supervision. And we're mandated. We are joining up to an ethical guidance saying that will be so. There's a little bit of flexibility in that, but not much. You need to be taking your client hours to supervision for very good reason, and you can't really miss that or stretch it. Specifically, if you're a student and you're in placement, as soon as you go past the required supervision hours, any hours that you're sat with a client actually don't count towards your final mark. So we're called upon to do it. This is not a nice to have. If we're working to an ethical framework and we're insured, it's something we need to really look at. Now, Rory, you mentioned, and I think this is an important one, you spoke about the gap of recognizing that you need a supervisor that understands your modality. You might have a specific client group that you work with, like trauma presentations, where you would expect the supervisor to have information in that area. You might be working online. You would expect the supervisor to understand online working to be able to work with you. Are there any other areas that we need to think about? Because we don't think of a gap, do we, if we've got a supervisor, because the gap is obviously filled by that supervisor. So I need another supervisor, it's more important you get the right supervisor for who you're seeing and how you're seeing them, Rory.
Yes, and the first thing I'd say is, you need to be realistic about the client group, the cohort of clients you're working with. If you're working with what I would call high risk clients, it's not a phrase I like to use, but those who maybe talk about taking their own life, self-harm, drug use. There's a myriad of presentations where the risk ramps up. You would need to think about, does the supervisor have experience in this area? As with trauma or emotionally intense work. So if you're working with clients who are experiencing trauma, and I think it's worth remembering that you've got to work very carefully with trauma. Clients who've come with trauma. You have to work carefully with every client, but with trauma, you have to be, I think, mindful in certain areas. Also, the therapeutic stage. Where are you with clients? Some might just be beginning their journey. Some might be coming to an ending. And then I would say, be realistic about the support. So if your supervisor says, well, I'm going in hospital for an operation, I think you really need a conversation, an honest conversation, and say, look, how long will you be away for? And then you can determine, do you need just perhaps one-off support? They may be away, at 1 calendar month. Or it could be short-term cover if they're off 3 months. Or is it going to be regular interim supervision? And I think it's worth reminding ourselves that when people go through unexpected and life-changing events, someone's gone through a bereavement, someone who might go to hospital for an operation that wasn't scheduled, it may be that coming back to work is very, very difficult. Someone might say, I'll be back in a month. But I think you have to be realistic and think, are they going to be back in a month? So you really have to think about that. And what I would say is you're not being disrespectful to your supervisor. Our job, I'll talk about me, my job when I was a therapist was to give the best possible service to my clients within the ethical framework that I worked under. And it's not a case of saying, well, I don't want to deprive my supervisor of their income and they're ill as well. I'll just wait 3 months until they come back. It doesn't work that way. As a supervisor, I wouldn't expect any of my supervisees to do that. I would be actively encouraging them at the point I say I'm off to look at other supervisors. And in fact, my supervisor, when she was off, gave me the card of her supervisor and arranged for us to meet so that we could meet up and see if we got on. Uh-huh. And that is what I call good practice management.
Yeah, it is. And it kind of leads me into what I was thinking of bringing. It's a beautiful segue, Rory, in that, if you're thinking about this now and saying, okay, what would I do in that situation if it arose? Then the next part of that is finding a supervisor who is the right fit for you, which can be tricky if you've got a short period of time where you need to get something in. I always say, the less time you have, generally the less choice you have and the more expensive things usually turn out when you got less time. You've got lots of time, you can plan and make plans. If you were putting this plan together now, there's nothing wrong with going and having a look and speaking to a number of supervisors and suggesting, I just wanted to meet up with you because do you offer what short-term supervision or limited time supervision if I should ever need it? Now, this might be gilding the lily, but the way I feel is when I looked for my supervisor, I didn't just go to one supervisor and say, right, there's my supervisor. In the same way as we wouldn't expect that a client might just go to the first therapist they see and go, yeah, that's my therapist now. We would expect that a client might shop around. They might look for someone who fits with them and who they are, that they feel comfortable with, to be able to open up with. And it's the same for us in supervision. If we have got choice, we don't always have choice, of course. Might have an agency where your supervision is built into that, and then this doesn't apply. But in this case, for me personally, I would have no issue in shopping around and speaking to a number of supervisors and dropping into them and saying, I've got a supervisor at the moment, but if anything ever happened, I wonder if you'd be up or interested in me contacting you as an emergency supervisor. And I think that leads on to where you might look and what the routes are of supervision. So what options do you have? So the temporary external supervisor, I guess, is what we've spoken about, and you would make sure that they fit you, your modality of working, your client group. There are also group supervision spaces. Now, group supervision spaces, they meet together, and it may be a number of individuals. It can be online, it can be in person, and there will be a group supervision experience, which definitely counts as supervision. There are different formulas on how you can count a group supervision, but it is a way of kind of filling in if another supervisor is not available in group supervision. And of course, I would suggest the following. If you are looking at group supervision, it's like any group. It forms together and it bonds together and it becomes a powerful group. Just dropping into a group can be quite difficult. Dropping in and saying I'm here for 2 sessions because I'm not seeing my supervisor will be disruptive to the group, and it's unlikely they would open the doors for that. But if you have regular supervision and perhaps group supervision, that's quite healthy, and it is maybe a hedge in the right direction there. You then have peer consultations, and I know, Rory, when we were both in practice, we would often chat, not bringing client details, but we would chat around clinical work and what we did, and those peer consultations are incredibly valuable. However, must stress on this one, they don't count as supervision. You can't say to your ethical body, well, I didn't have supervision, but I did have a chat with a colleague. But it can, I guess, reduce urgency and give you an area that you can that you can somebody you can speak to. And then, of course, there's the internal support, and that might be your clinical lead or your practice manager or somebody working within your counselling practice that you could go to, a safeguarding lead that you could speak to as well. You could maybe note that down if you had to do any defendable decision making of why you didn't take every single hour to supervision. You can say, while I was looking, I did the following things. And I wonder if there's anything you'd like to add to that, Rory, anything I might have missed or you want to go deeper into?
Yes. So you talked about peer supervision. What I would say, Ken, is that you need to check your ethical body's guidance, because I seem to remember reading many years ago that if you were a member of the BACP, it was acceptable if you were not an accredited member to have like a group supervision to count into your supervision hours. But when you became accredited, you had to have one-to-one supervision. And so I would check if you're a practitioner, if you're a private practitioner, check your ethical guidelines. Go to the ethical body, contact them, get that information, preferably emailed to you, so you've got an evidenceable chain. If you're a student, I know we have students listening to the private practice session of our podcast. You really need to look and speak with your tutor, because, as you rightly say, Ken, there's a totting up procedure to be able to claim the hours against the qualification, and any hours that aren't supervised do not count against the qualification, and it's a pretty strict ratio. And there are some awarding bodies will let you produce a letter. So I was off for a couple of weeks, and I suggested my supervisee look for another supervisor, and put her in the right direction, made some contacts, came back, and she hadn't done that. So I looked at the awarding body specifications, and they said you could write a letter of mitigation as long as it didn't run over, I think it was 14 days. So what I did was I wrote a letter of mitigation quoting the policy and sent it with a supervision log back to the college, who then sent it to the awarding body, and that was acceptable. Not great, I have to say. I would have preferred that person had found supervision.
Yeah.
So check. And also, I think there's a conversation to be had. Do you tell your client that you're using a different supervisor? And I'm not saying you should, but I'm saying I've never seen any ethical imperatives that say you should, but you might want to think about that. Because if you're working with someone who's got really big trust issues and you've contracted and you say, I speak not about you personally, I don't give you name or address, but the presentation to my supervisor, people are usually, every client I've ever had has been okay with that. I think bar one many years ago. But if you're changing, you might want to have a think about, do you tell your client? It may not be appropriate, but I think we have to have these conversations, Ken.
Oh, you've actually stepped into an area that I'm very interested in, and because I ask myself as you have these discussions, Rory, I say, what would I do in this situation? And for me, I think it's so important that the client would know now how the client knows, and when that client is told, is what's in question here. So my thinking on this, Rory, and this is why I love these discussions, because it gets me thinking about these things, is in my contract with my client, my initial contract, when we're speaking about confidentiality, I mentioned supervision, what it is, why I go, what I take to supervision, how that works, because it's important, because it is the client's information. And I explained that I work with a supervisor who is, like we are, under a contract to keep that confidentiality. So the client is aware that I take their presentations to supervision. I wonder if that is enough, because that's broad, and I'm still taking their information to supervision. It's just another person. I don't mention in my contract with the person who that supervisor is. And I think as long, for me, for my practice, as long as I was still contracted with the new supervisor with the same confidentiality contracting in place, that there would be no reason to tell them that I'd changed supervisors, in the same way as I wouldn't tell them that I've changed insurers. But I think it's important that they know, but I think it's important that they know at the very beginning of practice. And that's just my thinking on the go here. That's just my thinking on the go.
Yeah, well, I think you're on the right lines, Ken. I wonder what people listening to this think the listener thinks. Have you got thoughts on it? Why not chat about it in our Facebook group? And if you want to join our Facebook group, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, and we'll let you in. And why don't you have that conversation, get some peer feedback, because it is a very interesting conversation. I mean, I think my thinking would be guided by the nature of the relationship. And also, if I was working in a specific modality, I spoke to a colleague of mine yesterday who's a EMDR therapist, has specific supervision for that modality of therapy, working specifically with clients who are traumatized. And I wonder how I would form the contracts. I think maybe you're on the right lines, Ken. I think you are, actually. Maybe just say I have supervision and leave it in the plural as opposed to the singular. I have a supervision. Yeah. Supervision is singular. No letters.
Yeah, because if you did group supervision, if you think about how group supervision works, there's a momentum of the group that goes beyond a single person-to-person supervision, and you'd hardly be naming all the people in the group to the client of the group supervision that you go to. I think that the client would trust that they would be protected by the contract and that we would be contracted with the other professional. But what an interesting topic, and I'm sure there's people that will disagree, and you're 100% right to do so, and run your practice how you think, as long as it's ethical and aligns with your ethical body. I think what's important here, we said we're going to give you some resources. There's two resources we have for you. The one is another one of Rory's super duper handouts, which is what we've spoken about today, broken down into bullet points. We've got some lovely domains on there, including some that we haven't even covered here, like what you might put in that temporary agreement when you're setting it up, and how you might communicate that in an emergency to a new supervisor, and client work, which we'll probably look at in a moment, of how you might view taking on a new client with complex needs if you were undergoing, let's say, vulnerability in your supervision journey yourself. But before we do that, I wanted to give you the resource of where you go and look for a temporary supervisor. And of course, first stop for many is the ethical body that they belong to. Many ethical bodies will have a directory, and within that directory, you'll be able to put a filter on and look for supervisors, and you can look for supervisors in your area, or you might be working online or blended, and you might look for supervisors that work online. And that is true if you're in the UK, BACP, NCPS, UKCP. The other ethical bodies also will have a way of searching their directories. At Counselling Tutor, we've trained supervisors for a number of years. I was just looking recently, Rory, that we've had over 1,400 practitioners work through our supervision training course. And one of the things that we put in place as a result of practitioners graduating as supervisors is we decided to build a supervisor directory where those going in are vetted to check that they have a supervision qualification. If they're working, delivering supervision online, that they have the relevant qualifications for that, that they're ethically aligned, that they're insured, all that you would expect. And we'll give you the link to that. That is counsellingsupervisors.co.uk. There are only supervisors on that list. All of them can work remotely, and many of them also work in person as well, and many also offer group supervision on that platform. So you can filter and have a look for your area, or you can look for online working, and that is counsellingsupervisors.co.uk. But we'll give you the link to that and Rory's super duper handout. Just before I give the address of where we're going to get that super duper handout, Rory, I just wanted to end on an important topic, and it's now new clients. So something's happened in supervision. I now have put in place a temporary supervisor, and I know that this is going to be for a month or so, and then I might be moving back to my original supervisor after they have convalesced, we will say, in this made-up scenario. What are we considering with new clients at this time, Rory?
Well, I think we would be considering whether we take on clients with complex presentations, clients who would be, and I hate using this term, but high risk, clients who may be very, very vulnerable, clients who may contact you and say, I'm going through a court case at the moment, and I might have to give evidence. And I think that, as we often say, Ken, we're just two peers having a bit of a conversation about shooting the breeze about topics in counselling. I think it's where you are on your practice journey as well. If you've been doing this for a few years and you are, you're a bit seasoned in the work, and you've got a good contact network, which I think therapists should have. We shouldn't be working on our own, just in isolation. We should have a good contact network. I think that most therapists would be able to kind of do that. But I'm thinking of maybe the therapist who's just started on their practice journey, maybe just sort of taking that kind of fledgling flight from working in an agency to working on their own, and their supervisor goes off and they get contacted by someone who's, it has many facets that could be difficult. I'm thinking of someone who may be self-harming, someone who is using substances and is speaking about, taking their own life. I think you have to think really carefully about whether you want to take that on, not having your kind of standard supervision in place. But I think most therapists are kind of straight-headed, as we'd say in Manchester, and I think that most people make the right decision. But there are things to consider. That's what I would say. There are things to consider. Yeah.
And the document, the handout that Rory's made, is really good in helping you consider what is right for you. How do you get that? Well, you go to counsellingtutor.com. That's our website. Click on the podcast tab, find episode 357. That's today's episode. Right there on that page. It's there. It's your supervisor is not available, how to arrange alternative supervision handout download. You can download it, no charge, and that will arrive in your inbox. And that is ethical, sustainable practice for today. And we move from ethical, sustainable practice into practice matters, where we welcome back an old friend. Well, he's not old, is he? I'm the old one here. A long-standing friend of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. It's Dara McLaughlin from Web Healer, a sponsor of this podcast, doing incredible work where they build custom websites just for counsellors and psychotherapists. They really understand what we do and who we serve, and they do an incredible job. And they offer discounts to the Counselling Tutor audience, but not just discounts. Maybe you've got your own website with someone else, or you built it yourself or whatever. Dara's always happy to share information of what really matters. You met up with Dara. What was he talking about, Rory?
Well, Dara was talking about maximising your website's presence. It's a crowded market out there for therapists, and Dara has very kindly shared his expertise. If you went to a consultant for this, you'd be paying top dollar, and he shared with us how to maximise your website's presence. And it's one of a number of interviews I've done with Dara where he's talked about all aspects of having a website and making it more visible and converting eyes, if you like, on the website into phone calls or emails and converting that into having clients. I caught up with him, and this is what he shared.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice, that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
My guest today is a familiar voice many of you will already know. It's our podcast sponsor and regular contributor, Dara McLaughlin. Dara has shared some brilliant insights over the years on how counsellors can use their websites not just as a digital shopfront, but as a living tool to inform potential clients and reflect a professional and polished practice. Today, he joins us once again to talk through how to maximise your website's presence and integrate it effectively with your social platforms, creating a joined-up mixed economy approach to your online visibility. So a warm welcome back to the podcast, Dara McLaughlin. Good to see you again.
Hey, Rory. Thank you, Rory, and great to see you and to speak to the listeners again.
Yeah.
So looking forward to sharing some good information today.
Yeah, and as my mother used to say, first impressions are lasting impressions. And I guess when it comes to your website presence, when people jump on, first impressions matter, don't they? People are going to make a literally an instant decision on whether they're going to stay or they're going to hop off again.
Yeah, I mean, these days with the accessibility of the internet, we have internet on our phones, our tablets, and obviously on computers. It's just become so much more easier to flick to another website if you don't like what you see straight away. We've become very judgmental. It sounds terrible, but we'll all, I think, upon reflection, admit guilt here that if we come across a website we don't like, there's something that's just not clicking for us, we're gone. We're gone within seconds. And the internet and the tools that we have these days makes it incredibly easy to do that. So really, when you win a pair of eyes on your website, you win a visitor who has found your website and is looking to check you out, you really have to maximize your real estate, make sure that you keep them on board. So
yeah, so when you talk about real estate, what is it you're actually describing? I think we all think of real estate as where you build your house or where you put your garage maybe or where you store things. But when we're talking about real estate on a web page, what makes a web page really appealing for someone who initially jumps on?
Yeah, exactly. Well, as you say, real estate, your real estate on the internet is your website. It's your corner of the internet that allows you to show off who exactly you are, how you work, and so forth. So really, when somebody lands on that website, we always say you need to make a personal connection with the viewer instantly. And we always recommend putting a good, professionally taken photo of yourself on the website, making it look like you're approachable and you're introducing yourself to somebody, because, the internet is a very anonymous platform. And you need to build a connection with your viewer as soon as you possibly can. Following on from that, you need to go into this know, like, and trust. You need to talk about yourself. What is your education? What are your qualifications? What's your experience? And why should somebody decide to come along with you on their therapeutic journey? So, you're trying to really convey these things as quickly as possible, in as little, I suppose, as quickly as possible, as concisely as possible, so that you capture the attention of the viewer and you can get them to stay longer on the website. So picture, qualifications, and anything that you can put in there to build trust. Things like membership of ethical bodies, how long you've been practicing, maybe some information on some recent CPD events that you've gone to, anything like that that's going to, foster a trusting relationship between you and the viewer.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because in terms of the picture piece, a professionally took picture doesn't mean you use filters. I've seen some websites, not counsellors' websites, where the person's gone and used a filter, and as a consequence, it's not who they are. It's a digital representation of who they are. And I think my view would be that if I met someone after seeing their picture and it wasn't the picture on the website, I might be a little bit disappointed. So I think it's really important to make sure that you start off with that integrity and an up-to-date picture, because people change, don't they, Dara? And it's really important that the person you've seen on the website is the person you'll meet either online or in the therapy room.
Absolutely. I mean, look, trust is a cornerstone of this one-to-one relationship that you have with your therapist. And if you're getting off on the wrong foot straight away, I think it's a recipe for disaster. We also talk about real estate. We talk about maybe social profiles as well, Rory, and, what you're putting on your social profile. And you need to be incredibly careful there, because, when it comes to your social profile, these social media platforms, they will encourage a certain type of behavior and disclosure. And you need to make sure that whatever you're putting up there is matching and aligned with your website, so that there's a constant theme, no matter how the person is first introduced to you. So, trust can't be overstated, how important trust is, because at the end of the day, when somebody goes to fill out your contact form to maybe book an introductory call or make an inquiry, it's just so important that they feel that you're the right person that they want to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that clients are more discerning probably than they've ever been before, due to the fact that search engines and AI make it really easy to garner a huge amount of information about someone you're looking for. If you're buying a fridge or choosing a therapist, people do a lot of background research, and if they find you having a row on social media with someone or making ill-advised comments, that might put them off. I think also that, there's sometimes a tendency, Dara, to get a website and think, well, I've got a website now, I don't need to do anything to it. I've got my web presence, I've put my picture on, I'll just leave it and maybe concentrate my efforts on, social media or Instagram or whatever. But they are living things, websites, aren't they? They do need to be freshened up and to be kind of paid attention to. Nurtured is the word I'd use.
Yeah, nurtured and developed over time, for sure. And, just briefly going back to one of your previous points about first impressions, these days, when somebody is looking for a therapist, there are so many more of your colleagues on the internet offering their services. But also there are kind of therapy platforms, we all know, that are offering solutions to people, and they have huge marketing budgets. They are very adept at convincing people to turn from website visitors into website inquirers and potential clients for their own customers. So without mentioning names, it's really important to make sure that your website is always kept up to date and that you're putting your best foot forward, because these other platforms and your colleagues are certainly doing the same. So, what are we talking about here when we're saying, keep your website up to date? We're talking about keeping your clients engaged. We're talking about keeping them up to date with how you are developing as a therapist. At the end of the day, when we go to seek help, we want to make sure that the person we're working with is invested in positive outcomes for us. And how do you portray that on your website? Well, you can say, listen, I've been to this particular event, I've learned about X, Y, Z. And the beauty of what the website is, it allows you to expand in that long form content. So, for example, I think of the last in-person event that we were at last September. There was some fantastic talks by people talking about how to market your practice, for example, or how to balance the work-life balance and so forth. To be able to expand on those presentations and what you got from it, your website is a fantastic platform to be able to do that. And when you put yourself in the eyes of the website visitor who's coming to potentially work with you, if they see that you are engaged in, continuous professional development and making sure that, you're fully up to date with the latest and greatest techniques, terminology, and ways that you can help, then you're more likely to convert that person into a potential client. And juxtapose that with, again, some of these platforms where it's very sanitized and anonymized, and the individual therapists that are on these platforms don't have the ability to put themselves out there and talk about themselves and how they're developing. So that's why the website and your website is a fantastic tool to really show people that you're engaged, you're interested, and you want to help them succeed and overcome whatever hurdle they have at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk of long form content, maybe blog posts, talking about, or demonstrating to a potential client what you understand about their particular issue, depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress. Being able to, talk in a accessible voice that shows that if they came to you, you would be understanding, or you would have some form of understanding of their frame of reference. I think that's really important. Now, I guess one of the reasons, Dara, that people are put off updating the websites is because the therapists aren't natural website techies. Some may be, but I think generally speaking, all the therapists I've met find it a bit of an issue to do this themselves. How does WebHealer help here?
Well, look, we're fully on board with that. We're the website people, and our clients are typically people who are incredibly skilled in counseling and psychotherapy. And it's important to know where your strengths and weaknesses lie. We offer a service to keep a website up to date for people. So typically we will say to our clients, listen, if you have some long form content that you want on the website, you just send it to our team. And indeed, if you're not with WebHealer, Rory, any good web designer should offer that service to you, whereby you as the client can send them an email and say, listen, I've written up this article here, a case study, anonymized case study. I've written up this article on a CPD event that I went to. Can you please add it into my website? Put it where you think it's going to, work most for me. And a team like the team at WebHealer will go ahead and will do that for you. And doing that on your website is fantastic because, coming back and mentioning social media again, the short form that social media gives you, and I think about platforms like Instagram and so on, doesn't really give you the facility to put that long form content on. By all means, you can put a small post up there and say, hey, listen, I was at an event this weekend past. It was a fantastic event. We learned about X, Y, and Z. Check out my website for a full breakdown on what I learned and more about the day. And then your website obviously allows you to break it into more detail and to split it out. Again, you're fostering this trust and you're showing off that you are invested in continuous development and improving yourself. And that's what it's all about. And people want to work with therapists who are constantly upgrading their skill sets.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're employing, and this is what you're doing, if you're a client, you're employing somebody, you're exchanging money for skill and in some cases knowledge. So to have that regular update on your website and to be able to speak, in depth about what you've learned or what you might, how you might work with someone who presents with a certain condition or issue in their lives. I think really does link into know, like and trust, where people think, oh, well, they really get what's going on for me. I'd like to see that person. They really understand me. And that's something that isn't easily done in social media. But I guess a lot of therapists now have a mixed economy of how they present themselves, website and whatever media platform they find themselves using. And I think that there's something about, for me, and I don't know what your thoughts are, Dara, on being strategic in how you use your website and social media together to maximise that visibility and the trust.
Absolutely. I mean, look, let's not deny the prevalence of social media in our day-to-day lives right now. There are many people who are going to be listening to this section who don't have an account on Facebook, don't have an account on Instagram, and who aren't aware of what's going on those platforms. I always like to think about social media platforms sometimes as the high street. So, technically speaking, or supposedly the high street has lots of footfall on it. Not so sure about that these days, but you have your shop front out there, which is your website. And there are people, or your social profile, people are walking down that high street, they're on the platforms, they're looking around, and you have an opportunity to show yourself off. So social media profiles can almost be the lure, it can be the conversation opener. But once you get them in, that is when the website really comes into its own. Because if people are spending time on these platforms, you need to be where your potential clients are. Your potential clients, and we've all heard the studies about how much time people spend scrolling through their phones every day. Like it or love it, we need to be in those places if we're seeking to grow our practices. So if you have a profile on one of the social media platforms, fantastic way just to begin a conversation, to introduce yourself to that cohort of people who are out there looking. Now, it's incredibly important to say, and I'd invite all of the listeners to do it, even while they're listening to this right now, if they're at a computer, to search for a term like therapist in South London or therapist in Cornwall. You will not see Google returning any social media profiles. So that's why when we talk about the mixed economy and a balance, it's incredibly important to have your website ready, set up, primed for the search engine traffic, but also be on the social platforms with your profile there to begin the conversation with somebody and then to funnel them down to your website so that you get the best of both worlds effectively. So there's no doubt about it, it's a fantastic tool. The short form content isn't always fantastic for building that know, like, and trust. But even after doing a review today, Rory, of some of the busiest therapist and counselor profiles on Instagram, for example, in the majority of cases, all of those people are really prominently promoting people back to their website to book appointments, to read more, to purchase something, etc., etc. So, in combination, it's a very powerful recipe, but alone, social media profile isn't going to cut it.
Yeah. And I actually have a very dear friend who's got this absolutely right, Dara. She talks on social media about how her view of the world and how talks about emotions and how general situations in life cause people difficulty. And it's very, very engaging content. But she very cleverly has linked her website to her social media profile. So what happens is that people may find her on social media doing the old doom scrolling as you do, but they will be driven to her website. And her website then gives a more businessy feel. And when I say businessy, and I know a lot of therapists kind of step back and kind of get repelled by that, but when it's a businessy feel, that's the trust element of it. The fact that there's a privacy policy, the website is well put together, qualifications are shown, experience is shown, maybe a more long form content and she does this very well. She's a brilliant writer. She does a lot of long form content on her website where she'll talk about maybe some training and how she's integrated it into her practice. And I think she balances that mixed economy very, very well. And what also she does is she measures the success of her endeavours. So I think one of the things that maybe isn't well understood is simple metrics or analytics to track what's working on your website versus social media. That's where the gold is. That's where people find what is working, what people are liking, and what people are just jumping off their website for. Can you tell us a little bit about the metrics?
Yeah, I mean, look, you're 100% right. There's no point in writing all of this content and just fire and forgetting it and hoping that somebody will read it. You really need to know what's resonating with your audience. And if you're going to be, very focused, and you mentioned this is a business, it is a business at the end of the day. You want to invest your time producing content that people want to read. And so a good analytics package, and again, your web designer should include this, will show you very clearly what sections of your website people are spending most time on, where those people are coming from, even down to what devices they're on. So for example, if people are coming from your social profile and if they're jumping on to this long form content that you wrote about a CPD event, some training or a case study, so forth. You also know if they're leaving the website after they've consumed that content, which is known as a bounce rate, or if they're going on to another page. So if you've captured their attention now and they say, wow, this was good stuff, I'm going to go and read some more, you can get the percentages of people who are continuing the journey through the website. And that is a real metric for success. You can look at it and I suppose ascertain, are you investing your time wisely when you're producing this particular content? And the benefit of doing this on your website is, unfortunately, you don't have access to the same granularity of data on your social media platform. For example, if you're on a Facebook page, you just don't get that data. Same for an Instagram. You'll see how many people visited your page and so forth, and you see how many people liked your comments, your posts, or your reels, etc. But when it comes down to how long they spent reading a particular page of content, whether they continue to engage with your content thereafter or whatever, you just don't have that visibility. So having an effective stats package on your website is fantastic. And I would like to mention a particular tool which I recommend listeners reach out to their designer about. It's a tool from Microsoft Clarity it's called. It's a free package. And what it does is it integrates with your website and it provides incredibly detailed heat maps and visitor information. So you can really trace the user journey through your website and understand how people are using your website. And you can also understand where they're falling off too, which is incredibly important, because at the end of the day, you've probably fought hard to win that viewer. So you want to make sure that your website is laid out in a way that they continue to engage with it and they're not just dropping off as soon as they land on the website. So Microsoft Clarity, speak to your web designer, fantastic free tool to implement in your website.
And if people are interested in Microsoft Clarity, if you go to counsellingtutor.com, go to podcast episode 357, we'll put a link into that. So a link into the show notes, so you can have a look at that and maybe speak to your website designer to put that in. And I think on a kind of finishing note in terms of the website, it's your storefront. And, no store survives very long if they don't change the window display every so often. If you're in Easter and people have got Christmas trees in their storefront, you may very well not get a lot of people coming through the door. So it's really important to pay attention to it. And also there's a few common misconceptions that maybe people have about websites. Can we go through them? I'll start you off for a starter for 10, as they say. Websites are set and forget. You only need social media, or you don't need social. You just need social media. What other myths and misconceptions can we bust today, Dara?
Well, I would say that one thing that people really need to remember is that when it comes to a social media profile, you don't own this playground that you're playing on, and this pales very differently to, say, your website. Your website you own, you control the content and how it's laid out. when it comes to a social media profile, you don't own it. And we deal and we hear from our clients every week who've lost access to their social media profiles. And once they are gone, they are gone. And unfortunately, you're dealing with big tech whom aren't on the end of a telephone, who can't usually reinstate your access to your account. So it's really important to be very careful and to use social media full in the knowledge that one day the policies of this social media tech giant may change, may stop you from posting what you post, may block access to your account. You may lose access to your account for one reason or another, but ultimately you don't own it. So that is something that I would really like to highlight and remind people. I don't want to scaremonger, but I think people need to go in eyes wide open as to the benefits, but also the downfalls of having a social media profile. You mentioned another one, yes, set and forget, fantastic. You cannot build a website and just forget about it. People are that's going to stand out like a sore thumb. If you've ever been onto a restaurant's website and they have a menu from 2020, you say to yourself, I wonder, is that menu still valid today? You just don't even want to take the risk. You navigate and you go elsewhere. It doesn't instill confidence that you're alive and kicking, that you're up to date, and that you're invested in the success of the therapeutic journey with this particular client. And as I said as well, you cannot rely only on a social media profile if you're intending on gaining search traffic from the search engines. Search engines will not return social media profiles, for the most part, in their search results. So you need to have a website.
Well, wise words from someone who knows, has probably forgotten more about websites than I've ever known. So thank you so much for joining us. And it just goes for me to say, Darren McLaughlin, thank you for joining us.
Massive thank you to Dara from Web Healer, and massive thank you to you, Rory, for bringing us the all-important conversations. And that was today's Practice Matters. We now go into Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. And today in Student Services, a topic that may cause some emotions when you hear about it. It is, should counselling students pay for a placement? In other words, should they pay to be able to be there in placement, doing placement counselling for clients? Rory.
Oh dear, this is a really hard to talk about. And it's a topic that came up in our Facebook group, and it was a hard to read topic because someone posted that they'd applied for a placement, which, as we know, can be hard to get. And they were told they'd have to pay, I think it was either 50 or 100 UK pounds to go to that placement. And there was a long conversation along the lines of, don't we pay enough? Don't we give enough as students for absolutely nothing to get our qualifications? Are our qualifications really expensive? And one of the people who posted was literally at the end of the road with it. He said, I just haven't got any more money. And the fact of the matter is that I learned a very, very salutary lesson when I started as a placement counsellor in my student times. And when I qualified, I was asked to stay on and become a board member of the organisation of which I'd worked for. And I remember having a conversation with the then manager. That person's long gone now, but the then manager or the CEO. And he said to me, you know, Rory, on the face of it, we're a really fluffy organisation and we like to look after people and help them out. He said, but the reality is we're a business. And a few years later, I think about a year later, I ended up being the chair and director of the organisation. And I'm going to share the things that I learned. And the things that I learned was that charities are reliant on either public donations or someone who gives them a lot of money, a benefactor, or they're funded by the government. And the people who give you the funding, they'll give you money, but you have a contract. And that contract tells you what you can spend the money on, because a lot of charities are kind of, what would I say? They're kind of arms of the state, if you like. You're taking state money and they give you a contract. And in that contract, I was absolutely surprised that a very small portion of that money was allocated to counselling. There were lots of other tranches of money that were allocated to assessment or reporting or other activities, but counselling wasn't particularly well funded. And the counselling manager had to take the money she had to pay her own salary, and then what was left, then try and use it to support the counselling part of the operation. And that looked like at one point we got £10 for every supervision. We got a £10 contribution. We got a sandwich for lunch if we stayed more than so many hours. And she would work really, really hard to get us free CPD. People would come in and give us CPD. And that's how it is. And that's the reality of it. When people say charities are kind of don't care about counselling and exploiting therapists, it's not the charity. The charity has to work to a contract that by what's called the commissioners. And the commissioners are government or local government people who look at the charity, look at the need in the area, and then they write a contract and then put money to that contract and give it to you. And talking to friends of mine who still work in the charitable sector, that stream of money has for a long time become less and less. And then make another point. I'll make another point here, Ken. If you're running a charity, you can employ people to do a multitude of jobs. And, so for instance, I started as a support worker, and we had someone who was a former social worker who would come in and train us on how to offer support. Signposting. It was signposting support. People come in crisis. We'd listen very carefully, and then we'd offer signposting. It might be to Women's Aid. It might be to drug and alcohol recovery services. It could be to benefits advisor, that type of thing. But when you're running a counselling service, you have to have a clinical lead, because a clinical lead is someone who's qualified and will look at the clients, assess them, and then allocate them to students. And the truth of the matter is, clinical leads aren't cheap. They aren't cheap. And a lot of the clinical leads, I know they don't work for what they're worth, and they're worth a lot more, but they usually, in my experience, and I'm talking of conversations I've had and working in a charity 20 years ago, they usually take up most of the budget, because that's how it works. The idea is that the clinical lead will be paid from the budget, and then the students work pro bono. They work for free to acquire their hours. But even that budget now is being cut. So as a consequence of that, to employ a clinical lead, where does the money come from? And I suspect in some cases, but not all, the donation for the training goes towards employing someone who can triage. It's a rubbish situation, Ken, absolutely rubbish. But I'm afraid it's where we're at this point.
It is. It is. And I appreciate that you're kind of weighing in on what it might look like behind that. And what I've heard you say there and share from your experience and seeing the other side of a charity and what is required in that is that maybe if they are charging money, they're not doing it to profit or to boost their coffers. They're doing it to cover the costs to be able to deliver that service. I think it's broken. That's my feeling, is that the system is broken. And you spoke about funding, and I know it all too well. I worked in a job where I was in communication with the commissioners. We had a bid writer on our team that was writing the bids to win those contracts in with the commissioners. And here's the way that it actually works. If you're a student, think about this. If you're submitting an assignment on your base theory, you can't just write anything you like. You got to hit the criteria. You got to work to what the awarding body wants you to evidence. And the same is true in bids. There is a requirement that you match their criteria to even get a shout in on the bid. And as you say, Rory, the money has been cut and cut and cut. And I think it's a sign of a broken system where the funds are not maybe allocated correctly. I think it needs a refresh, definitely. And I think it's sad for me, and this is just my own personal feelings. I'm not speaking for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm speaking for me, Ken Kelly, practitioner. I think it's sad because I think that, first of all, it puts that pressure on the student to pay in those circumstances where a student decides they are going to take that placement where they're paying in. And I think that it puts the biggest strain at service level, where there are people that are getting shorter term than they should and not getting the care that we know we can give, because the funding system doesn't allow for that. And let's hope that our ethical bodies and professional standards can work towards making that known. And I know they are. They're doing an incredible job. I know, Rory, you're connected at the very top levels of those. You know the movers and the shakers, and they're always presenting to Parliament and trying to make us seen, and doing some great work there. But then there's the other side of this as well, and this is why we've brought in Paul, our roving roving correspondent.
Yes, roving correspondent,
and just give me an inkling of what Paul looked at on this.
Well, I caught up with Paul Cullen, and we spoke about, if you are in that position of having to pay for a placement, then having a look at what your fee is going to get you, getting, as Paul mentioned, a bang for the buck. So it's my great pleasure to welcome back Paul Cullen. So hi, Paul. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay, thanks, Rory. How are you today?
I'm very well. And as you heard, Ken and myself have kind of done a kind of an introduction to this very contentious topic of student counsellors paying for replacement. Now, as a supervisor, what would your thoughts be if a supervisee came to you and said, "Look, I've got a placement, but they're asking me for £100 for a training course"? What would your reaction be?
Well, it's an interesting topic, isn't it? And that, when I think back to my formal training and that, and I had to go on placements, and I don't know that I could have afforded to pay any kind of fee beforehand and that. So I guess if a supervisor was to come to me, I'd be wanting to know what is this placement able to provide you? What kind of support are they providing you? How are they going to be utilising that money? What are you getting out of it? For example, is it going to pay towards maybe expenses for you to get to and from the placements? Is it perhaps going to be covering maybe insurance, and that the insurance that's going to be needed, the personal indemnity insurance, is it going to pay towards your own supervision? Are they going to be providing supervision? We know that for students, costs are already, quite difficult to kind of maintain and to keep up. And this is just an additional cost. So, what are they exactly going to be getting out of it? What does that money cover?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think what we're talking about here, Paul, is value for money.
Absolutely. Bang for your buck. Bang for your buck. That's the one.
Yeah. What you're getting for your money. And can you outline the kind of things that it would be desirable to see? If someone said, well, you can have a place, but it's going to cost you £100.
Yeah.
What would you hope that placement would have in place?
Well, more often than not, within placements and that, you need to have a DBS check. So is this potentially going to be covering the DBS check and that's going to be needed for that organisation? Is that organisation going to be providing in-house supervision? And so is this going to be, perhaps providing supervision for them, or at least allowing them to pay part way towards their own supervision? And that, again, people having to travel to placements and that, the price of fuel, and that can be quite expensive. So getting to and from your placements, and that, is there an expenses things that you can be claiming for there? Does this ensure that you're going to be on the organisation's, business insurance, in personal indemnity insurance, and that for providing a counselling service? So I'd be wanting to know that those things are going to be in place, and that for my supervisees, and that, to ensure that they are getting, bang for their buck, they're getting value for money. And I guess another question that it kind of raises, that, we know that students have to complete a certain number of hours. Are they being guaranteed about how many client hours are going to be provided? What kind of guarantees are the organisation offering?
Yeah, and I think, having taught at practice level for a good 10 years, and I have, a student myself in the misty past, there is a fear about gaining a placement, because it's one of those things that is a little bit out of your control. You go to the college or training provider, they take the money off you, you have a place, off you go. But the placement is something that's a bit of a variable, really, and you have to find them yourselves. And I think part of that's a kind of a character building exercise for you to get motivated and start to ring people up and start to put yourself out there. But also, I'm with you. What do you get for that money? And in terms of, if they say, well, we do a training package, my question would be, well, what's that training package? Do you get a certificate, and how are you going to use it?
Yeah, you talked about training. So if that's like around CPD and in-house CPD, well, what kind of CPD is it going to be offering? What kind of training is coming under that? And like you said, does it provide certification and that, so that can be counted towards people's CPD? Because I think another one of the risks that kind of came to my mind is it can potentially, disenfranchise certain people. £100 is still £100, Rory. And, it's an amount of money, and whatever the amount is, and that, it could be pushing people beyond their limitations. So is there an element of some people are going to be disenfranchised because they can't afford to put that money out up front, which, they don't know what the return's going to be. So I think it's really important, for students to kind of consider, what are the returns going to be on this for me? How is this going to benefit me and help me to get to where I want to be, which is, down the line, and having that qualification as a qualified counsellor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think perhaps if I was being asked to pay £100, I'm quite mean with money. So I'm thinking £100, that's,
So money,
how many tea bags is that?
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
And my thoughts, and I think something that maybe students should be bold and ask, is, does that go to fund maybe a qualified counsellor who does the triage? Because that's important, isn't it?
Well, yeah, this is another thing, and that, when we've got students in placement and that, we're wanting to ensure that they're getting the right clients for their level of competence and that, so in that early stage, and that when you're first going into practice and you may be feeling a little bit inexperienced and that, who is getting allocated? How is that getting allocated? So have they got a experienced qualified counsellor that's maybe being paid for out of that fee that is being put up front by the students to ensure that those clients that are coming in are getting assessed, and then they're getting handed over to the student counsellor, and that in the full knowledge and that it's been triaged initially by a qualified, experienced therapist.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is important. Maybe it might be worth just kind of outlining why what the term triage means and why it's important to the student.
So again, when we're considering a triage, and a triage is an assessment that is taking place where the person who's carrying out the assessment of that client is able to consider the presenting issue and that the number of different factors that might be in place and ensure that they are being safely allocated to a student that is able to meet their current requirements rather than potentially being allocated a client with complex issues which might be out of the current practice and experience of the student counsellor.
Yeah, the scope of practice. Yeah, and I think that's really important because I think without that filter, that's what triage really is. It's a filter. So you get the clients coming in and then they're filtered into different therapists with different levels of experience and skill sets. And the danger is without that filter, what can happen is that a student counsellor can get overwhelmed. They can get someone and they're totally out of their depth.
Absolutely. And, and it's something that I've seen happen in practice. It's something that I've experienced in my early training. When we were getting allocated clients that were beyond my realms of competence, and I had to raise questions. I raised questions with my supervisor, and we got in touch with the placement. This was many, many years ago, because we need to ensure that the client that's being allocated is being allocated someone who, again, feels that they can work within their wheel of competence and that through that filter of a triage.
Yeah, and as a supervisor, is that something that you build into your supervision practice when working with students?
Yeah, it is really, and that, I mean, it's a conversation that when I've worked with students and that, we do have a conversation about how our clients allocated to you, and that, and obviously, if any kind of concerns are raised, and that throughout supervision, and that we're always kind of exploring, the students. We're exploring how the student feels about the client that they're working with, that they're working within their competence, within their modality, and within their level of experience.
Yeah, so it's just so important.
Yeah.
And I fear, and I say the word fear because, as you say, any cost that's added on to training is a potential barrier. I fear that we're going to see probably more organisations start to put a charge for training. I guess one of the things that an organisation may say, and I'm trying to kind of play devil's advocate here, is that by paying a fee to undergo a training course, you're going to get commitment. I've often heard this discussed, that, when people pay, they're more likely to be committed. What's your thoughts on that?
I can understand why that might be the thinking of it, and that it might potentially, cause commitment. But what about passion? What about enthusiasm? And that, people don't come to counselling for, they don't come to counselling and that to make money. They come to counselling because it's a calling. It's very much a calling. And I think, and again, when I think about the students that I've worked with, the passion and the enthusiasm and the desire to kind of work in the field, I think vastly, outweighs any potential kind of amount of money. I don't know What do you think about that, Rory?
Well, I think it's a zero-sum argument, to be honest, because people who train to be counsellors, know certainly in the practice years, if they're doing diploma or above, know that they're going to have to do a placement, and that placement hours are crucial to qualifying. And in all my time as a supervisor, I've only come across a handful of people who, for reasons that are quite valid, have decided that they want to not progress their studies. I don't think putting a financial cost on is going to make anybody any more motivated. I don't think that's a credible argument at all. So, any final thoughts on what students might want to consider? I know we've covered a lot, but any final observations, Paul?
Well, again, I think, if a student finds himself in that situation, it's about finding out what that is about. What am I going to get out of it? And that goes towards, when you're going for an interview for a placement, remember that you're interviewing them too. Because they're getting you. They're getting someone who is at the top of their academic learning, is ready to go out and work with people and that. So they're getting a really highly motivated, passionate, enthusiastic therapist and that, with a good level of academic knowledge that they're now going to start putting into practice. So what are they offering you? Because they're getting a really good, I think they're getting a really good deal when they're getting the students and that, because, the students that I've worked with are just so enthusiastic and so passionate and that, so ensuring that any kind of payment that you're making up front, that you're finding out how is that broken down? What do you get out of this placement?
Yeah, absolutely. Value for money, as you may say in Yorkshire, Paul, where you are. Value for money. So, Paul Cullen, thank you so much for sharing your observations. And it's back to you, Ken, in the studio.
Thank you, Paul Cullen, our roving correspondent. Thank you, Rory, for bringing the all-important topics. That one, I'm certain, will get many people talking, thinking, considering what their stand is on that. As you quite rightly said, Rory, and we say often, we're two colleagues shooting the breeze. We don't hold any kind of lead on this. It's we just look at the topics that you're speaking about. And this has been episode 357 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Indeed, Ken. And before I wrap up, I'd just like to say thank you to all those people who work in the charitable sector. It's underpraised work in my view. And you do a fantastic job. And I speak as someone whose family has benefited from those people who work for free. As someone once said to me, volunteering is the oil that oils the wheels of society. And I think that's very true. But to wrap up the Counselling Tutor Podcast, we started with, when your usual supervisor isn't available, do you have a plan B, and what that plan B might look like? In Practice Matters, we're joined by Darren McLaughlin, who is an expert on websites and website placement, and he shared huge amounts of information on how to maximise your website's presence. And on student services, we came along and we asked the difficult question, should counselling students pay for a placement? And comment by our external reporter, Paul Cullen. And it just goes for me to say thank you for your shares, likes and subscribes. And until the next time, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.
you.